Thank you, Senator Smith. Senator Rhiannon.
Thank you, Madam Acting President. The mining industry has created the myth that it is the backbone of the economy, creating jobs and providing a foundation of prosperity, particularly for rural and regional Australia. The slick campaigns that the mining industry run present this false picture. The reality is that mining is not a big jobs creator. In many areas, it is in fact a jobs killer, and in my home state of New South Wales, that is becoming more and more apparent. Mining employs less than 2% of the Australian workforce. As of July this year, at least 26,000 people have been lost in the Australian mining industry. In the first 6 months of the global financial crisis, the industry in fact shed 15% of its employees. The Australia Institute has produced a very useful report, Mining the Truth, the Rhetoric and Reality of the Commodities Boom. They found that the inclusion of figures for indirect employment in mining employment figures is often used by the mining industry. This makes employment in mining appear substantially larger than it otherwise would if we relied on the official Australian Bureau of Statistics. Now, the mining industry actually pays economists and consultants to estimate the size of their industry's multiplier. That's so they can estimate the number of indirect jobs, and that's what then they bring forward, these extraordinary figures. Now, the Australia Institute has actually estimated if the number of indirect jobs associated with every industry were totalled, the number of jobs in the economy would exceed 30 million, almost 3 times the size of the Australian labour market. Now, that certainly does put a cloud over what the mining industry brings forward. Now, this multiplier effect only makes employment in the mining industry look significantly larger when the sum of direct and indirect jobs in the mining industry is compared with only the direct jobs in other industries. Once the multiplier is applied to all other industries, mining once again returns to being a very small employer in Australia. The mining industry, in fact, has played a very small role in the growth of employment in Australia over the past 7 years. The increase in jobs in the mining sector accounts for only 7% of the total employment creation over that period. I set out that information to highlight how the mining industry has been able to get away with its deception. This great myth perpetrated by the mining industry is starkly on display when we look at the coal industry. At the end of 2012, out of a national workforce of 11 million, the coal industry employed just over 45,700 workers. To put in perspective the small returns from this industry, employers in the coal industry is 1/4 of the number of those working in the tertiary education sector, and a bit more, probably a few thousand more, than in the printing and publishing industry and in the dairy sector. The success of the con job the mining industry puts over Australia is revealed in some further research from the Australia Institute. A survey showed Australians believe 16% of workers are employed in the mining industry. The average response was that was the average response, around 16%. But as I mentioned, according to ABS figures, it's less than 2%. It's coming in at about 1.9%. Now, the same survey found Australians believe mining accounts for more than 1/3, actually 35% of economic activity. Now, when we remember that on top of this failure to deliver on the promised jobs and economy benefits to our society, we also have to deal with the damage caused by mining to public health, the local environment and the world's climate. It's clearly time for a reassessment of the role of this industry in our society and in our economy. And for the record, because when I find that when I speak about the mining industry, the Greens' position is often distorted. The Greens are not advocating a mining industry shutdown. My comments tonight is about correcting the lies and distortions pushed by mining multinationals, their peak organisations and their lobbyists. It is actually time governments worked on transitioning our economy to clean jobs, clean energy delivery and clean manufacturing. This is where there is real jobs growth that will last for decades and decades. Even with the resource abundance this country has, it is clearly time to recast our economic structure towards greater ecological sustainable practices. But right now, the coal rush is on. Coal multinationals can see multi-billion-dollar profits, not million-dollar profits. We are talking huge amounts of money here. In June this year, Greenpeace released a very useful report that it disclosed 91 proposed coal projects in this country will triple production of export coal over the coming decade, from 300 to 900 million tonnes per annum. Now, this contrasts very sharply with the assets involved in developing a clean economy. Now, these assets are long-lived, but they do take capital and time to become established. And this, again, why we need to come back to the role of government. Government needs to step up to the plate and work on this transition. Because we know right now the mining industry is damaging our economy. Research shows that when new mines are developed, jobs in other industries are lost. Mining does not create jobs these days. It is, as I've said, a jobs killer. This is because when mining developments go ahead, they push jobs in other industries out. Economist Matt Grundoff has found that the mining industry in Queensland has the potential to crowd out 20,000 non-mining jobs in manufacturing, tourism and agriculture. This makes sense of the thousands of dollars the industry has recently spent on trying to argue it can coexist with others. We've seen the same thing in New South Wales, with the industry presenting that it can live with the farming industry, with the wine industry, with horse breeders. But as we've seen, particularly in the Hunter, that is certainly not the reality, with many of those industries being forced to leave that beautiful valley. So what we see is thousands of dollars that the industry has spent arguing how all these industries can exist together. The idea seems to be that if the data doesn't match the reality, well, you bring forward a very expensive advertising campaign. In the last financial year, BHP Billiton brought in profits at $12 billion. So clearly these advertising campaigns, which are expensive by most people's standards, for these big companies are barely petty cash. Rio Tinto's half-yearly profits for 2013 were $1.7 billion. Glencore Xstrata's underlying profit was $2.04 billion. With 83% of mining companies being foreign-owned, the idea that they are all part of our national interest is an absolute myth. They already pay 7.1% less tax than the industry average. So again, the economy is not even gaining the benefit many people expect come from the mining industry. And the evidence is in that we can create thousands of jobs that will last well through the 21st century. According to the University of Technology in Sydney, Institute of Sustainable Futures, just 2,016 people were directly employed in the renewable energy sector in New South Wales in 2010, with an additional 1,500 in the energy efficiency sector. Now, at the same time, there are less than 1,800 people currently employed in New South Wales coal-fired power stations and less than 4,000 coal miners supplying their fuel. And there's a very important report that came out from the University of Newcastle Centre of Full Employment and Equity. Now, these figures are from 2008, but again they reveal the jobs that can be generated. This centre identified that between 61,400 and 73,800 direct and indirect jobs could be created in New South Wales by transitioning to 100% renewable energy sources. And then there is the work of the Beyond Zero Emissions, Zero Carbon Australia 2020 Stationary Energy Plan. This comes from 2011. They identified just under 161,000 direct jobs could be created in the renewable energy sector over a 10-year period. And based on their estimations, 16,405 jobs would be created in the renewable energy sector in New South Wales in the first 3 years of implementing the plan. So the jobs growth that can be created in the renewable energy sector, in clean manufacturing, is massive, and again there is a clear role for government here. And these very exciting figures have again been emphasised by the Clean Energy Council. This council estimates that the nearly $12 billion of proposed investment in 28 wind farm developments in New South Wales would create 3,940 jobs if they were to go ahead. Currently, we have only 197 people employed in the wind farm industry in New South Wales. So again, that potential is there, it is waiting to take off, and the role of government clearly is very urgent. What highlights the importance of this issue is when we look at unemployment, particularly unemployment in regional areas and unemployment amongst young people. Because we do need to actually look at these figures in these different sectors. Because often these days I find that the talk about unemployment is quite muted. We're told that unemployment isn't too bad, that the national unemployment rate is under 6%, so our economy can create that. But again, we need to look deeper, that there is real hardship, there's misery in many areas. We're getting generation after generation where families have not had adults going out to work, and the flow-on effect is enormous. The loss to our economy is considerable, as well as the damage done to so many individuals. The statistical bulletin released by the Commonwealth Parliamentary Library reports that in October this year, 61,000 young people were actively looking for full-time work. Now, that was a drop since August, when the figures were 65,900. But when you look at the figures, when you look at those monthly reports, they're regularly above 60,000. I mean, that's a tragedy for young people to start off life in this way. And the overall youth unemployment rate is at about 26% around the country. In my state of New South Wales, some very worrying figures. In the city of Wollongong, 41.3% youth unemployment. Then if you go to the Hunter region, you find for young people aged from 15 to 19, the figures of unemployment are bouncing between 16 and 18%. And for young men, it's usually a bit above 20%. Again, such wasted talent, such a terrible way to start one's life. And I bring those two threads together, these high rates of unemployment amongst young people, particularly in regional areas, and the potential for jobs growth in clean energy, because this is where we can give real opportunities for the next generation. It's worth remembering that in the Our Plan document released by the Liberal Party in January this year as part of their election campaign, the issue of youth unemployment only gets one direct reference, and it is that the party has been listening. That's the word, listening to concerns about youth unemployment. Now, that's totally inadequate, it's insulting, it's damaging not just to those young people, but to the very fabric of our society and also our future. A much more detailed focus on this issue is required. One of the frequently cited problems that I do hear when because I'm often talking on this issue about the potential for jobs growth in clean manufacturing, clean energy delivery, is the number of skilled employees. And this is where there does need to be much more work undertaken by our governments, because right now there is a real problem, often with the lack of support for apprentices. Many unemployed young people have low levels of literacy and numeracy, and so the transition is often challenged because of this lack of a skilled workforce, which brings us to the very important issue of our TAFE system. Vocational education and training has been undermined by both policies at the state and federal level, I always thought it was disappointing when Labor were in government that they didn't tighten up how the federal government was interacting with state governments, considering the huge amounts of money that have been handed over to states for the TAFE system. More conditions could have been put on how that money is to be used in vocational education and training, because what we've seen, particularly in Victoria, but also increasingly in New South Wales and Queensland and in other states, is dumping TAFE into a competition against low-cost, low-quality private providers, where it's then a race to the bottom in terms of the types of courses that are provided and that long-term planning that we so need when you want to develop a skilled workforce is lost. In New South Wales, the O'Farrell government has cut $800 million out of future TAFE budgets, and it's cut 800 jobs. And many of those jobs are in the Hunter and Illawarra areas that I have just spoken about. By far the majority of them are across regional Australia. And this destruction of TAFE, and I do not use those words lightly because I find it very troubling when one has to describe public education in that way, but that is what is happening right at the moment. The undermining of this wonderful public vocational education and training institution is damaging the very strength of our economy. Many young people don't have the opportunities now because where can they go to gain the skills that they need and our economy so desperately needs. Now, there is many things that the federal government can do, both, as I've said, in terms of its interaction with TAFE, so the competition with these quite weak and profit-driven private providers is removed. The federal government also can be a powerful catalyst for change in terms of bringing forward a regulatory environment in the marketplace for a shift to renewable energy, because that is now under a very urgent time frame. Initiatives are needed to target coal-dependent areas like the Hunter and the Illawarra and work on the transition to that clean energy that we know, clean energy economy that we know can deliver such a jobs-rich future. So the mining industry, as I set out at the beginning of my contribution tonight, has been very deceptive in how it presents itself, because we need to be more accurate here in terms of what the mining industry is actually doing to our economy. It's driving up the exchange rate. It's also driving up the cost of skilled labour for businesses in other sectors, which has been very, very damaging, particularly to the higher education sector, to tourism. It's driving up the price of raw materials used in mining even. We see this particularly with concrete and other associated costs. And then it's generally driving up the cost of other services, particularly construction. So this does really distort our economy enormously, and again further underlines the deception that the mining industry promotes in terms of the myth that it is the very basis of a healthy Australian economy. Because the economic policy that the coal industry is based on is really there to serve just 1% of society. And what I mean by that is those people who rely on mega profits, where that money is not used for the majority of people. Because the old idea of trade-offs between environment and jobs and the economy needs to be reassessed. That no longer works for where society is at the present time. The environmental challenges are too urgent. We need to ensure that mining is not misleading and getting subsidies that it doesn't warrant, that it is taking most of the profits overseas. It's time that government stepped in, worked on a transition so we can ensure that the next generation does have the jobs that it needs for its individual, in the health of those individuals and the health of our economy and society.